These color bars are provided as a reference for you to adjust your playback system, ensuring maximum picture quality. Please adjust your sets now. In tape number 1, we discussed camera controls and how they affect a photograph. In this tape, we will explore a method of determining correct exposure in a variety of conditions without the use of a light meter. Rob Winner explains.
You know, most cameras today have fairly sophisticated built-in light metering systems, and generally they work pretty well in all situations. Yet many professional photographers at times ignore these systems and determine their exposure with a method that has been around since long before the advanced meters of today. This method or system is based on the fact that the sun is a constant brightness reference. Essentially, this means whether you're in San Francisco, Paris, New York, or Milan, the brightness level of the sun remains unchanged as long as it is a clear day and the sun is greater than 20 degrees above the horizon. Knowing this fact, photographers have devised a system sometimes referred to as the Sweet 16 rule or basic daylight exposure. Regardless of what you call it, the fact is this is a very accurate system for determining exposure. In many cases, it can be faster, easier, and occasionally more accurate than the light meter systems themselves. Let's take a look at how the system works. The reference aperture will always be f/16 if you use a shutter speed which is reciprocal of the film's ISO. A simple way to think of this is 1 over the ISO at our reference aperture of f/16. For example, if we're using Kodak's Ektar 125 film with an ISO of 125, the shutter speed would be 1/125th of a second. If we were using Kodachrome film with an ISO of 64, we'd use 1 over 60 or 1/60th of a second as our shutter speed and set the lens aperture at our reference aperture of f/16. This will always be the appropriate exposure for a bright, sunny day with those particular films.
This system of exposure control is accurate anytime the sky is clear and the sun is 20 degrees above the horizon. The actual exposures for these images were identical. Around the world, bright sun conditions will result in the same exposure. Although not as obvious, these images were also exposed at BDE. A camera's light meter might be fooled by the lighting and give an incorrect exposure reading. Kodak gives you a similar reference with each roll of film you purchase. This reference or guide will enable you to set the camera's exposure for a variety of conditions relative to the film's speed.
We've been saying exposure reference in explaining this process. What we mean is that any exposure which is equivalent to the basic daylight exposure or Sunny 16 rule will be appropriate. For example, these photographs were taken on the same roll of Kodachrome 64 film on the same day using the basic daylight exposure rule. However, if you will notice a difference in the motion or lack of motion in the athlete. One was taken at f/16 at a 60th. This shutter speed allowed the photographer to make an effective photograph implying motion and speed. The other was taken at 1/500th at f/5.6, freezing the action of the runner. The photographer increased the shutter speed by 3 stops and opened up the aperture by 3 stops from the original reference of 1/60th of a second at f/16.
This graphic illustrates the idea of equivalent exposure. The first example was taken at 1/60th of a second at f/16. The second image was exposed at 1/500th of a second at f/5.6, which is the same relative exposure. This Hasselblad lens is designed to offer the photographer equivalent exposures quickly and very efficiently.
The concept of equivalent exposure allows the photographer creative freedom to use any appropriate shutter speed and aperture combination for controlling depth of field and motion.
Now, Rob just explained how the sun can be utilized as a reference in determining exposures in daylight situations. The same reference, that sun, can be used for a variety of other lighting conditions. For example, if you are in a situation where the lighting is heavy overcast, you can vary the exposure 3 stops from basic daylight and end up with a very nice photograph. What this means is that your film will need 3 stops more light than BDE to properly record that particular scene. Another good situation where BDE works well is a night football game. There you're going to need about 6 stops more light than BDE. Now, how you come up with those 6 stops? There are a variety of ways. You can open your aperture, you can slow down your shutter speed, or you can do any combination of the two. But what I'd suggest is if you're in a predominantly low-level light situation, that you use faster film. Another useful situation for BDE is the candlelight close-up. Here you're going to need 10.5 stops more light than BDE. The BDE method is accurate, and it can be used for almost any lighting condition.
This concept of exposure called basic daylight, which we've been discussing, is not only an accurate system, but is relied upon by many professional photographers. When this system is used properly, you can have full confidence that your exposures will be precise. Again, 1 over the ISO at f/16 is the basic formula to use as a reference on a bright, sunny day. We also want to take a moment and review the concept of equivalent exposures. If you increase the amount of light striking your film by opening your aperture, you must decrease the light an equal amount by using a faster shutter speed. In order for the exposures to be equivalent, the aperture and shutter speed must offset each other. Exposures which are determined to be a set distance away from basic daylight exposure are another very helpful technique in control. The examples on the enclosed chart have all been tested at the recommended exposures and are accurate. We recommend that you test a variety of films at different ISOs at the recommended exposures in a variety of different conditions.